My name is Nathan Freitas. I'm the director and founder of Guardian Project. I've been doing that for the last 15 years, and where the focus is building privacy and security tools using free and open source software, and sort of designing them around the needs of activists, human rights defenders, and journalists. So through that, I was a fellow here about 9 or 10 years ago at the Berkman Center, then now Berkman Klein. And I just brought that experience as like a builder, a practitioner. Harvard's a great place. There's a lot of brilliant people who write papers and books and hold conferences, but people shipping apps to millions of people in the world is kind of in some ways more unique. So.
I think I remember your project since it was known and scandals. I think you were one of the first developing some whistleblower tool.
Exactly, yeah. So my team builds a variety of interesting functionalities on mobile and the web based on use cases that are not traditional. And so someone will come to us rather than, my early career was more in corporate technology. And at that time, an activist was happy to get like a BlackBerry or a Nextel, like trickle down technology from the business use case. And so I wanted to turn that upside down. So it's designed for the threat model and the use cases of a journalist or someone who might be targeted by a nation state and collaborate with interesting people like Edward Snowden, who has these kind of use cases in mind that others don't.
I get in the subject, but we can say general.
Yeah.
We are making this documentary about post-quantum cryptography, but actually we also call it post-cryptography because actually we don't know how it will work out. So I don't know, just your general opinions about it.
Something that we've thought about for a long time in this work is forward secrecy. This idea of not just something being encrypted now, but will it still be encrypted 10 years from now? And when you're talking about a variety of use cases, it could be the messages you're sending that are flowing through a mobile operator network, or you're talking about whistleblower data, you're talking about protecting something like evidence for war crimes in the long term. You have to think in 5, 10, 20-year scales when computation will change. And so a lot of it is not just today, but tomorrow and beyond, and how the change in attacks and the change in computational power of adversaries will change. So that's on our mind quite a bit, as well as being in that boundary between real and theoretical all of the time. And it's kind of what we do is we believe what others think is unbelievable. We think about someone will say, hey, my phone is acting weird. Something's happening. And other people might call that person paranoid. And immediately I'm like, well, that could be this, 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 or this. And I'll believe you. It's like the Ghostbusters. We're ready to believe you. And particularly with kind of this area of post-quantum, it's like, okay, well, we understand we don't know everything, but we have to think about that post-crypto moment and do what we can to prepare.
So you think that threat is already here, or you are preparing for the next 10 years, 5 years? When do you think, or again, it could be also here, by the NSA, by the Chinese government, or, I know no one knows, right?
Yeah.
But what is your expectation?
The threats are always here, and there's always some novel attack that you need to be working to counter. So as an example, encrypted voice, like doing a signal call, or, it used to be a Skype call or a Jitsi call or a Zoom call. But there's something interesting about encrypted voice, which is if you know it's someone speaking, you already have an insight in how to crack that encryption. And it turns out machine learning can actually do a better job at like guessing because it knows its voice. And so there's already novel attacks like that aren't about post-quantum, but are about new kinds of computing, right? You also have the attacks like Pegasus and baseband attacks that infect phones from the bottom up, right? So we're always thinking about these different coming problems that are also current. Forward secrecy, well, there's already, encryption algorithms where you can have perfect forward secrecy by rotating keys. So that move from like, okay, we're using public key cryptography, but now we're not just going to use one key, we're going to keep changing the keys such that if one key is compromised, you don't get everything. Yeah. So that shift from PGP, which is one key, to something like the double ratchet axolotl signal protocol, where you're rotating keys all the time, is one of those small steps to the future to counter that you'll learn from when you're actually implementing post-quantum countermeasures.
So, of course, you're aware of the NIST algorithms, post-quantum algorithms. Have you been looking at that? Do you have an opinion about those? What we hear from other interviews, that some are very excited and they think that's already a solution. But actually, people that work more in the field, they are saying, well, we don't know yet, because also we don't have the quantum computers anyway, so actually we cannot test them. I don't know if you have a particular opinion about this situation.
It's always good when you have some established starting point, and you have agreements that maybe that they're sound and you can test them. At the same time, there's been looking back at various issues in cryptography, there's been problems in the past with sort of people saying, yep, it's solved, here it is, this is good enough. So I think that is not necessarily the approach we want to take in our taking. We are, through the open source work we do and working in open source code bases like OpenSSL, which is starting to implement some of these, we're very excited because, in fact, we just did a release candidate of some of our Tor software for mobile phones that has that built in, right? And so we said it's our first post-quantum release, right? But the Tor network itself is still rolling this out, becoming ready across the board with support broadly. And we have to weigh like, well, how much more compute power will that take? How much more memory, right? A lot of it is practical resources. And if we go too far in the future, you degrade the performance today. The other aspects of this we've looked at are, groups like Signal have done their own pass on it, where they're layering both encryption together, right? And they're putting an envelope around what they're already doing. That seems like a smart design, and you can start, so ultimately having the NIST work is important, but most of our effort will be in all of the other related problems and trying to actually make this practical. And so, we're slowly taking steps forward.
I make this kind of technical lead for them, for having them making more questions on that part. Let's say that public key cryptography is going to be broken tomorrow, or in 5 years, so we don't know. The implementation of a post-quantum cryptographic system means to upgrade softwares, protocols, hardware, and that's going to take a while, right? So how do you see this transition to this post-quantum cryptography?
Definitely will require effort at different scales depending on the system you're talking about. There is, we've again seen in the open source software world when there's so many dependencies that projects have, and some are maintained and some are not maintained. And some are, you have a vulnerability because you didn't realize so-and-so X project was depending on an old version. And so first kind of detecting that and understanding where you might have some post-quantum upgrade here, but not over here because you didn't kind of put those together. And that also brings up the supply chain, and how we're doing retrieving those dependencies when you build software. That's increasingly something we've thought about, is we've seen attacks move down into the supply chain. I can't break the endpoint. I might be able to infect one of the libraries. Working with the Tor project, one of the interesting things there is that it is a community-driven project. We have thousands of people running Tor relays and infrastructure and nodes. That's how it sustains itself. It's not one group like Signal, which I'll talk about next. And it's great financially, but it's also it means upgrades are slow. Things roll out, take a long time to roll out, unless there's like a big emergency, right? So if you ring the red alert, then people move faster. But even now we have to give incentives for people to upgrade, and it takes a while for all the clients. And we have tens of millions of active clients out there. We've got all of the servers, and so that's probably would take weeks to months to kind of roll out, unless you on the Tor front, unless you really I don't know, you shut down the old thing, perhaps. You might have to do that clean break and say, look, we cannot guarantee this. We're turning it off. Contrasted with Signal, and this is one of the reasons Signal is not federated or decentralized, right? Why it's run by one organization, because Moxie said, look, I want the most secure thing. I don't want to deal with all of this lagging interoperability, bad upgrade stuff. I just want the Signal stack is boom. It's the single stack. We run it. We control it. They can upgrade it overnight, right? So things that are less open and not kind of driven by that kind of, the Signal is quite open on the code base, but the way it's run isn't. And that's where I think you go back to something like email, and we're still trying to get SMTP servers to have basic encryption on them, right? The web is a little better of a story because of Let's Encrypt was a huge success. That's a point of hope, like how quickly we went from HTTP to HTTPS. So I think that could be the way you think about time scale, is how many people run servers and is how open and federated and interoperable is the system versus a centralized system, so I think the other hopeful thing I would say is when you've had things like Heartbleed, or some of these other massive vulnerabilities, it was quite a call to action, and everyone moved quickly in the days. So that would be the hope. And then, like I said, we just released some post-quantum resilient code today. So maybe we've got everyone covered. I don't know.
Right. So wait, what do you mean on Tor project?
Yeah. So our Orbot, which is the mobile version of Tor, we just put out our release candidate with some of it's available. If the network says, hey, I can speak these versions of TLS that are post-quantum, it will. I see Tor not as, the dark net and whistleblowers. Onion routing is about confidential, authenticated routing of internet packets. That's what the Onion protocol is. The internet was started broken without confidentiality or authentication. So anyone could redirect packets and everyone could see every packet. And so I've pitched to the West Point Cyber Academy, to Amazon Web Services, to major industry, you should be using Onion routing on everything, because it'll give you that extra layer and of network privacy that you don't have. Because if you're, Internet of Things devices that you're deploying around the world, those can all be observed at the packet level, so people know what devices each house is running, and when someone comes home because they turn the light switch off and on, for instance, and that activates a packet to the internet. And so there is a world where someone takes me seriously, and and all of our power stations, the power grid runs over Onion. That's a real thing I've pitched, because we keep seeing attacks on the grid because they expose their public IP addresses. And then you add a post-quantum attack on top of that, and we're screwed. So, I'm hopeful that the work, the end-to-end encryption of messages is also another great success story, where that, for years, we were trying to encrypt text messages, and I wrote some stuff on old Java phones, Moxie and others. A bunch of us were playing around with it. And then, when we started focusing on Tor things, Moxie started focusing on Signal, or Text Secure at the time, and built something great. And then WhatsApp adopted it, right? And then suddenly 1 billion people have end-to-end encrypted messaging, and now it's trickled out into the world. So I think there's reasons for hope, but that the work that's being done in true kind of open source privacy and security will be respected and supported.
So I wanted to talk just a little bit more about something important that you brought up, which is like the dependency chain.
Yeah.
And how even the best laid plans in the 3 layers down might hit like hardware bedrock. Right, that can't be upgraded.
Yeah.
That can't be adapted. And it makes the entire path of remediation just non-viable. And people aren't going to throw out their phones unless there's some red alert.
Yeah.
So the time frame for some things becomes indefinite or unresolvable, and for other things, it's like a decade, right?
Yeah.
Before the hardware rollover, right? Server replacements. Does that sound about fair? You might have a decade rollout for like a whole large corporate org,
Right.
before they replace all their stuff.
Agreed. And definitely when we're talking about mobile phones and mobile operators, they're the worst culprits at this. I mean, the sort of 2G, 3G, 4G, 5G, I mean, are
all the G's now.
Yeah, and they're kind of layered on top of each other, and our mobile infrastructure is still horrifically compromised all the time. I mean, this is what was announced recently about, Chinese state surveillance in our phone infrastructure. It's something I've been talking about for 8 years at least, and why our government is relying on Signal poorly. They don't do a good job of it, of course, but that's because there's fundamental vulnerabilities in the mobile infrastructure that are of this kind, right? The encryption isn't right. They don't have things on. There's a known vulnerability in the signaling layer, SS7. And then that extends to the baseband in your phones, which is very proprietary, hard to upgrade, and kind of based on like mass products that Qualcomm and others just kind of want to sell out in the world, and have perhaps some intentional backdoors for surveillance and law enforcement activities. So you have a bunch of factors coming together that will mean that the fix for this problem will be based on the hardware upgrade cycle and not a patch. So
at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
It comes down to, yep.
So I think you're absolutely right, and it will be interesting to think about how the cloud providers will handle this. I mean, this evolution where we all used to run our own physical servers, and now we just sort of press a button and we have 100 servers. I think that's probably a good thing in that, they'll just push stuff forward and we don't even think about, what's underneath. So, again, some hope there through centralization. When we have decentralized things like the mobile operator networks and all that infrastructure, it's where it'll be rough.
A little bit of follow-on that. It's like extending from it. You also mentioned Let's Encrypt and the success story that has been, and it's been amazing actually. When I used to run my own web servers, sometimes even the physical hardware, if I was taking in a password for some application, no matter how ridiculous the application, create an account on this little thing, right? Yeah. I would buy an SSL cert, right? I had to pay, and I had to wait to get my identity verified and everything. Yeah. And getting the entire web onto HTTPS without Let's Encrypt or something similar would have been a financial impossibility.
Exactly.
And a goldmine for someone taking advantage of the situation, but they would have never gotten that goldmine. There's no way for everyone to do that. It was a specialized thing. All of a sudden it's open. Right. And this precious certificate has become something that rolls over every 3 months on standard. Yeah. And thank goodness.
Yeah, and also at the high end, the reason Facebook, for instance, didn't want to have HTTPS on all of the time. So Facebook used to have HTTPS when you logged in, and then otherwise with HTTP. So it was cost of compute. Mm-hmm. It costs more to do encrypted communications, and at their level, that was hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps, if not tens. So I think this is an area where, again, going back to what will it take to deploy post-quantum cryptography, it's, bigger numbers and more math and harder math and more processing power. And fortunately, our devices are insane now with what we can do with computation, and so locally on the device. So that's an area where maybe we can hit the ability to do that sooner than the attacks come, as opposed to, and there's a financial piece where maybe the devices have there's such spare compute power in our phones, for instance, and even in our laptops, that, we can probably deploy all this stuff now with not much of an impact, versus then people were like, no, we are not turning on HTTPS for everything because our data centers can't handle it. And the financial cost was huge. I would work with nonprofits and groups that say, okay, we'll buy a cert. And then a year later, like, hey, to renew it, they would say, we have to pay again? And so the auto renew of Let's Encrypt, and just saying, hey, this is a baseline of what we need, and you can add fancier certificates on top of it. But it's an amazing project, and I think everyone who worked on that, and EFF and others, should get so much credit, because they had to think both, not just technically, but creatively around the campaign, around the partnerships. There's a lot that came together to make that happen. So maybe this is a clue as well of what it would take to kind of, the PQ World campaign rollout needs some more creativity like that.
Going back to the very root of the current cryptography system, or at least everything that's based on public key encryption, let's imagine that tomorrow, in 5 years from now, again, that model of encryption is broken. And that is actually the heart of many other things.
Yeah.
Do you see that kind of like situation?
Of course. I mean, public key cryptography really has so much value to the way the internet functions. Of, I don't know you and you don't know me, but we can establish this channel, right? We don't have to exchange, lists of keys ahead of time. All of those things that were, clear breakthroughs, say in World War II, right, or earlier symmetric systems. However, I mean, it is interesting that symmetric cryptography is resilient to these kinds of attacks, and that there are still, applications and use cases where that could be almost thought of as a fallback. You can have, I don't know, other approaches and other ways to prepare that are, again, there would be, it's always one of those moments you think, okay, symmetric, oh wait, public key's there, right? You're like, it keeps sneaking in different layers of the stack and the protocol. But even, there's work we do with notarization of chain of custody of photo and video files, for instance, in order to have verifiable proof of evidence, right? That's one of our projects. It's called Proof Mode. So in that system, we actually combine together a whole bunch of different things. We do, SHA-256, SHA-512 hashes of everything. We do PGP signing, and, we do use the public key in that case, but we can we layer different pieces together. We do notarization on the blockchain and potentially Ethereum to enable to have that in the ledger. We do now this new standard that uses X509 certificates through the content provenance and authentication standard. So what we've done there is try to, again, kind of layer different things in different pieces. And you could have that same system could say, all right, we're going to use a symmetric key that I've pre-shared with my team, right, as the root layer inside of all of those other pieces.
This is fascinating what you said. Something that we've discussed several times and continue to discuss is perhaps by laying down the foundation of a trusted relationship ahead of needing it, that might be one of the layers that is we will be glad that we have it, and it would come from an already trusted set of connections, and then we could rely on that if the asymmetric is not in place, at least the symmetric, and as you mentioned, it's pre-established symmetric encryption, and you can't do it when you can't get the communication go. You need to have it already in place when you need to lean on that. Yeah.
We take this model with a number of human rights and other organizations we support that have a very real threat of their standard communication system being compromised through legal, physical, whatever. And it's happened. And some organizations, they sort of didn't prepare and didn't do what we said, and they were sort of completely locked out of any safe way to communicate because everything was that they were used to was gone. Others are, prepared, and they have this whole kind of alternate backup system, a hard line, that we call it. And so that in that way, yeah, they're like know what to do to move to that system when they need it to kind of break glass and have it ready. I think this is important, and I think that on the other topic of which relates to this is there is always a cost for an attacker to target you, right? And that's another thing we often do. Like, how important are you? How realistic? How much compute are you worth? And and this is kind of the safe. How strong of a safe do I need to buy? And if I buy a strong enough safe, and it's just some random thief who breaks into my house, then it's probably good enough to stop them, right? As opposed to someone who is trying to backdoor Tor, for instance, or something. And so I think this idea of, again, layering where you have safes within safes, also just like, ooh, we brought the tool for that safe. Now we're in here. It's a totally different tool to break that safe. And we didn't even know it was there, right? So that approach of that layering and kind of thinking about how you can just slow everything down, because that's how all encryption is. It's just friction. It's nothing is for sure.
We're also thinking about accessing like data centers and identity verifications, and all of those things are based all on the same thing, that is factoring two numbers and one-way function.
It's magic, right? It's like
too much magic.
This one trick.
Yeah, one trick. And so, but if that is also the point of vulnerability of quantum computing. So, because it takes so much to upgrade everything eventually, even the hardware. So maybe just making keys differently maybe is enough. I don't know. Could be.
There's an interesting idea when you were talking. I just thought of it as, you in a society that kind of understands everything we're talking about, the sort of digital risks, or maybe even not, but you could declare kind of a digital pandemic in a sense. Like, would people take it seriously? I mean, some of these previous vulnerabilities have gotten to the front page of newspapers, right? People would ask me did you hear about that? And it was not just a Heartbleed, but some of the others. Even like Pegasus now is one that like we go to an activist event and everyone lines up to have their phone scanned because they believe it. It's common enough. And so would you have this like, oh yeah, we need to, shut down everything for a week because we don't want to just kind of randomly guess, because it's everywhere, right? It's in every system. If it's part of our cars, it's part of our transportation. It's part of the, airplanes and hospitals. And, I think that would be obviously, shutting down the world takes a huge cost. And hopefully we can do enough before then to get there.
So we've discussed, and it gets into quantum networking, but we've discussed the network phenomenon as you described, being able to know just that there is traffic, even if it's encrypted traffic, just knowing that something's happening because there's traffic and traffic's from here to here. That's a type of information. And in talking about quantum networking, the joke is if it's been compromised and then it gets thrown out, then compromise everything and the flow of data stops. I know it's not that simple, but you can pinch the tube, pinch the pipe, and the water supply gets cut off. There's a lot of fallout that can happen to infrastructure, power grid being one, and telecommunications. That's the underpinnings of like air traffic control and so on. Is if in fact, knowing that traffic is flowing at all is a piece of the puzzle. Then you can prevent the flow, might start to cause problems. And I think the onion routing is one of the most important things as a layer of the internet, and I am surprised that it isn't the only infrastructure that we are willing to operate on. But that's, as you say, the adoption takes it doesn't get rolled out overnight, and not everyone sees the value. But so that's thoughts on that. The networking, compromise the networking by pinching off the flow, the pipe itself.
I mean, we need to think deeply about the first, second, third order effects of this happening, and the areas where having greater access control because of this vulnerability allows these other things to happen. The the traffic analysis and targeting of specific streams and people based on that is really powerful and harmful. From the human side, I've had people get deported from countries, people that I support, authoritarian states, and someone will come to their house and say, we don't know who you were talking to or what you're saying. No, we don't know what you're saying, but we know who you were talking to roughly, and that's not okay, and you need to leave. Or mapping out a network based on, group chat traffic, and maybe they get one person's phone they're kidnapped, and they use that phone, and then they can just say, well, we don't have all your messages, but we know you're all talking. And these kinds of, this kind of collateral damage around traffic analysis extends to, observing the network of people participating in any sort of data exchange, communication, and devices. So I think that is blocking that ability to know, how things are routing, and adding that mix protects everybody, right? And by having a mixed network like that, you're really ensuring that, that whether it's law enforcement and government or a journalist, that together they're protected. And that's the theory of Tor, is it's good for everybody. And that's why the US Navy designed it. And now it's out in the world for, whistleblowers. It's a nice idea, and it's a utopian vision a bit. But there is a technical underpinning there of confidential packet routing is good as a defense against many attacks, whether current crypto or post-quantum. And that's, again, this kind of deep threat modeling. We my team at Guardian Project worked for 2 years with UNICEF, actually, on building what we call the holistic tech assessment framework around this new class of software for civil registration and vital statistics. So this is birth and death records and marriage and vaccination. So that a lot of countries still paper-based. They're moving to digital, and there's a bunch of potentially good systems, and they want to use open source and promote it. They had no way of assessing, they would say, yep, we're good. Yep, it's audited. What does that mean in such a complex app process? So we actually built this whole holistic tech assessment. That was, yes, part of it was auditing the code and dependencies and the ciphers. Part of it was auditing their documentation for deployment. What does their production environment look like? Part of it was auditing, data sovereignty laws in different countries where it might be used and what they would be forced to log or who would have access. Part of it was saying, are they a good kind of steward of the open source community, and what is their response time to closing vulnerabilities that get reported, for instance? We did this whole thing of what it meant to be secure. And we ran it across 4 different projects, and it worked. I mean, we sort of uncovered the ones that really stood up to the test well, and some others, they got really mad at us because we said, you might have a compelling product, but the way you're building it is horrible and is so easily compromised by either technically or by a human, And none of them had thought of genocide in their threat model, right? Which is, if you're talking about birth records and everything about people, you don't think about that. And none of them had considered that threat. And we came in and just said, here's the scenario, tribal warfare, and the government. And so that's the kind of thinking that we need to do, is more holistic and be ready to talk about these worst case scenarios, because it's pretty bad what could happen, but we can get there if we do.
You mentioned earlier that and I think this was an underlying theme in this conversation, that you consider all scenarios that most people think are impossible as being possible. In most of the interviews that we've been doing as part of this, we hear a recurring theme is that yes, quantum computers can break current cryptography methods, but that's, like 10, 20, 30 years away. We don't have the technology to do it at the moment. We saw recently a research paper that was published that had an algorithm that was able to do it with 1 qubit, but the drawback was that you needed the energy from like several stars or something.
But the qubit is not the bottleneck.
Right.
Yes.
Point, yeah.
Yes. So how likely or how realistic do you think the scenario that someone would be able to tackle that problem and develop an algorithm that's able to use the quantum computers we have right now with like 5 or 10 qubits? Or is that like science fiction?
I feel better about trying to come up with a time range or scenario in this case because, I mean, as opposed to like self-driving cars, we're not like selling like a feature, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, maybe there's people that are creating scare because they want the business of, fixing stuff. But we're all just trying to be, many of us, responsible and thoughtful about this. And so I think it's fascinating to have a paper like that because they're showing, they're examining where the bottlenecks or constraints are and showing that they can move and saying, well, maybe that problem could be solved and there's a breakthrough on energy or the reason I'm also willing to believe scenarios that don't seem near term is just in my own life what I've seen in terms of the increasing computing that, when I was a kind of working after, early graduate kind of work at University of California, we had our supercomputer, the big computer that was like, 1 gigahertz or something ridiculously small and tiny now. And it was just like this amazing thing. I remember being in awe and thinking like, what if one day I could have something like that? And of course, we all have it in our pocket many times over. And you might say, well, that could have been predicted. And that was 30 years ago. So, on that scale, I've seen kind of a leap. And so, we were also tinkering with like early things like Google Maps and doing a lot of geospatial data work in that project that I was a part of. And we had inklings of things like, what if you could do all this sort of data sets tied into maps and you had satellite and kind of early Google Maps kind of things. And so it was that same feel where we saw pieces of this stuff happening. So yeah, on that, maybe it is that sort of 20-year, it's still like 2 decades, let's say, in some ways. But I'm not against some really unexpected breakthrough that is related to, the human spirit to like have those kind of, authentic fundamental breakthroughs in energy or computation or chip design. But at this part of my life, like I feel, the work I started Guardian Project is 15 years old. And that gives me a certain sense of feeling that like just by saying it's 10 or 20 years doesn't mean it's that far away. So it doesn't, that's a fine kind of scale to be working on. And it means we should be concerned. We shouldn't be debilitated. And we should continue to like endeavor, and also I talk about my wife's work in public health quite a bit because I'm always very impressed by it and say getting people to stop smoking, working on vaccines and, she's, seen the gamut on kind of disease and health impacts and places where you suddenly have this breakthrough in America with smoking being banned and normalized. And I lived in New York City for a while and we're like, what? No way can they ever ban smoking in New York City. And then they did, and it changed it. And we're all happy for it. And, and similar, like with COVID and, like the ability to create vaccines so quickly is still shocking that happened because of certain breakthroughs. So I think there's other worlds we can look at on timescales and see, help us kind of find some metaphors or approaches that we should take here, but treat it just as seriously.
The only difference here that a breakthrough would destroy everything.
Wrong kind of breakthrough.
And then fix it later, but still would be.
I know that is such a funny relationship of how we're always trying to break our own code.
Maybe Tor could be the future of the internet and post-quantum, but there is like any constraint on the scale of traffic? I mean, if everyone switched to Tor, would be still good?
The onion routing definitely adds a layer of performance hit in the way that HTTPS and TLS does. It's gotten less and less. So 15 years ago, when we first got Tor running on an Android phone, it was very slow. Everyone's like, oh, Tor on a phone? No way, right? They said the same thing, PGP on a phone, and this is what it's gonna work, it's gonna work. And now, like, I basically run my whole phone through Tor, do calls over it, do YouTube, streaming. There's a lot of focus on performance now in the work of Tor because they understand not everyone needs to do 6 hops through the Tor network. Some people are happy with 2 or 3 hops, right? And there's different types of traffic, and you can make it more or less performant as a kind of slider based on the kind of traffic. When I do signal over Tor, it's asynchronous. I don't sense the slowness, right? Because messaging, you just send the message. So there's certain applications that are real time where the onion routing adds that hit, and others you have no idea. Synchronizing email, I have no idea how long or slow that was. It just popped in. So yeah, the other really fascinating thing is we are more and more using phones as part of the Tor routing network. And so every night when I put my phone on my nightstand and plug it in, my phone becomes called a snowflake proxy that allows people in countries where Tor is blocked to go through my phone to get into Tor. So I have hundreds of people from Russia and Iran and China that use my public IP on my phone as a proxy. And so really making it a peer-to-peer network. And so I think I will continue to pitch the onion routing as either an abstract concept or a specific piece of software of Tor implementing it as a big, kind of vaccination for the internet that should be adopted more broadly.
And we talk about the ownership of this algorithm or this new network. Sometimes we talk about how people can access or who is going to use it. I don't know if you have any ideas of that.
As I said at the beginning, the mission and part of Guardian Project is to provide privacy and security to all, and even more so designing our sort of threat modeling and use cases for those that were often neglected. And I think a lot about that in this sort of digital divide from a security perspective and what rights or access do people have who are, kind of the most harmed and exploited. So in that sense that, these questions about how quickly can we roll fixes out and who's going to get the upgrade? Is it just when you get a new phone, right? Or is it the person who's on the super old iPhone because they can't afford a new one? And I think that sort of equity and, access is important when we think about the countermeasures. So a lot of that too is why free and open source software, I think, is a part of it from an ethical perspective. That, getting schools and, public institutions on free and open source software as their infrastructure so that they don't, for a long time, I worked with the Tibetan exile community in North India, and they all used pirated copies of Windows for everything. So not only they had no support plan, they were not getting upgrades, and they were super compromised. GhostNet was the first huge, big botnet that was an espionage botnet. It was uncovered in His Holiness the Dalai Lama's office computer, right, by my friend, my colleague. So we got them either onto Linux or onto Chrome or onto actual Windows licenses, which has gotten so. I think we need to think quite a bit about that upgrade cycle, the supply chain, and from an equity perspective to make sure that no one gets left behind when this happens. So.
Nice, thank you.